The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of streetlights buzzed against the silence, casting long, eerie shadows on the neatly paved road. A black luxury sedan rolled slowly through the well-manicured neighborhood, its driver calm, relaxed, until the red and blue lights flashed behind him. The man sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Not again. He pulled over to the curb, taking a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He had been through this before. Too many times. But each time, it never got easier. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car. Their movements were tense, sharp. One adjusted his belt, resting his hand near his holster as they approached the sedan. The driver's side window slid down smoothly. "License and registration," the taller officer ordered, voice firm. His eyes flicked over the man inside, narrowing slightly. The driver complied, reaching slowly toward his glove compartment. He had learned not to make sudden movements. The last thing he needed was a misunderstanding that could turn deadly. "You in a hurry to get somewhere tonight?" the second officer asked, peering into the car's interior, scanning for anything that could justify their stop. "Just heading home," the man replied evenly, handing over his documents. The first officer studied the license, his lips pressing into a thin line. His partner leaned over, glancing at it as well. They exchanged a quick look. "This your car?" The man exhaled slowly. "Yes, it's my car." "Where do you live?" "Downtown." The taller officer raised an eyebrow. "Long way from home, isn't it?" The man could feel it now, that shift in their tone, that creeping suspicion. It was always the same. Black man. Nice car. Wrong neighborhood. Mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment? His jaw tightened. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" The second officer stiffened slightly, as if not expecting him to push back. "Standard procedure," he said quickly. The man didn't move. He had spent years in courtrooms, questioning officers on the stand, breaking down their justifications, exposing bias, demanding accountability. He knew the law. More importantly, he knew his rights. "This a routine traffic stop?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. The taller officer's jaw clenched. "You were driving under the speed limit." Looked a little suspicious. The man gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Didn't know obeying traffic laws made me a suspect." "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer said again, this time more forcefully. The tension thickened. A still moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. The man considered his options. He could argue. He could challenge them right here, right now. But he knew how this would go. With a slow nod, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the door open, stepping onto the pavement. The officers watched him carefully, their hands lingering near their weapons.
"Turn around, hands on the car," the second officer ordered. The man turned, placing his palms flat against the cool surface of his car. He could feel the streetlights glow burning on his skin, illuminating the scene like a stage performance. Behind him, he heard the rustle of a radio. "Dispatch, we got a possible suspicious individual, requesting." "That won't be necessary," the man interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. The officers froze. Slowly, the man turned around. His eyes locked onto the taller officers, with an intensity that made him hesitate. Then, with precise movements, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. The officers tensed. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge. The silence was deafening. Both officers stared at it. Blinked. Looked at him. Looked back at the badge. State Attorney General's office. The man watched their faces change, first confusion, then disbelief, then panic. "You're..." The taller officer's voice trailed off. "The state's top prosecutor," the man finished for him. "And I'd love to hear your justification for this stop." The second officer swallowed hard. Sir, we were just what? The prosecutor's voice remained cool, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Conducting an illegal stop? Racially profiling me? Or were you about to escalate this into something worse? Neither officer spoke. They looked at each other, desperately searching for an exit from this nightmare they had created. The prosecutor took a slow step forward, watching them squirm. He had spent his career in courtrooms exposing injustices like this. But tonight, it wasn't happening to someone else. Tonight, he was the one standing in the glare of flashing lights, being treated like a suspect in his own state. His state. The one where he fought for justice. The one where he worked to ensure men like these officers were held accountable. And yet, here he was. After a long, charged silence, he let out a breath, shaking his head. "Run my plates," he said. "Verify who I am. Then we'll talk." The officers scrambled, retreating to their cruiser, their hands shaking slightly as they typed his license plate number into their system. 30 seconds later, their worst fears were confirmed. They turned back, eyes wide. The prosecutor crossed his arms, waiting. "So," he said, "what's the official reason for this stop again?" The officers looked at each other, but no words came. The weight of the situation pressed down on them like a crushing force. The prosecutor stepped closer. "I want names. Badge numbers." The second officer immediately rattled off his information, eyes darting to the ground. The taller one hesitated but followed suit. The prosecutor took out his phone, snapping a picture of their patrol car's license plate. "I'll be filing a complaint," he said evenly. "And we will be having a conversation, soon."
The officers stood stiffly, their jaws clenched, their hands gripping their belts. For the first time that night, they were the ones feeling exposed. Without another word, the prosecutor turned, got back into his car, and rolled up the window. He took one last glance in the mirror, watching the two officers stand frozen on the sidewalk. Then, with the smooth press of the gas pedal, he pulled away. His heart pounded in his chest. Not from fear. Not from anger. From exhaustion. Because no matter how many cases he won, no matter how many laws he helped change, no matter how many speeches he gave, tonight had proven that the fight was far from over. And he wasn't done yet. The glow of the city lights flickered across the windshield as the prosecutor drove home, his grip tight on the wheel. The night's events played on a loop in his mind. It didn't matter that he was one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. It didn't matter that he had spent years working to change the system from within. In the eyes of those officers, he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He exhaled, the weight of it all pressing down on him. But how had it come to this? 12 hours earlier the morning sun streamed through the office window, casting long shadows over the desk cluttered with legal briefs, deposition transcripts, and a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. The prosecutor sat in his chair, reviewing the latest cases of police misconduct that had crossed his desk. He had built his career fighting for justice, real justice, not just the kind that existed on paper. He had taken on corruption, exposed wrongful convictions, and prosecuted officers who abused their power. But for every victory, there were a dozen setbacks. His phone buzzed. "Sir, the meeting with the governor's task force starts in 20 minutes, his assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Thanks, I'll be right there." He grabbed his briefcase and made his way out, his mind already focused on the agenda. Police reform. Oversight. Mandatory de-escalation training. It was the same discussion they'd had a dozen times before. The governor's office was a grand building, all polished floors and high ceilings. Inside the conference room, city officials, law enforcement leaders, and activists filled the long table, their expressions tense. The prosecutor took his seat. "We need real action," he said firmly. "Not just another round of empty promises. Transparency. Accountability. If officers know there are real consequences for racial profiling, for misconduct, then we start seeing real change. Some in the room nodded. Others, particularly the representatives from the police unions, remained silent.
A commissioner leaned forward. And how do you propose we do that, exactly? We already have oversight boards, training programs, then why are we still seeing the same issues? The prosecutor met his gaze. If training worked, if oversight worked, then we wouldn't have officers stopping people based on the color of their skin rather than their actions. The room grew quiet. The prosecutor continued. Let's be clear, the problem isn't lack of training. It's the culture. The mindset. That's what needs to change. There was an uneasy shuffle of papers. A police chief cleared his throat. Look, we all want accountability, but what? The prosecutor cut in. But you don't want to discipline bad officers? But you don't want to hold your own accountable? A silence fell over the room. The prosecutor leaned back, knowing he had made his point. But would it make a difference? By the time the meeting ended, it felt like just another round of words with little action. He stepped outside, letting the cool air hit his face. His assistant walked up beside him. Long meeting, huh? He gave a small, tired smile. Same as always. A lot of talk. Not enough action. She hesitated. Did you see the news this morning? Another case. A guy in his own neighborhood, just walking home. Stopped, questioned. Handcuffed. No charges, of course. His stomach tightened. He had read the headlines. Another black man treated like a criminal for simply existing. Yeah, he said quietly. I saw. That evening, the day stretched long, filled with back-to-back meetings, court filings, and press calls. By the time he left the office, the sun had set, leaving the city bathed in the glow of streetlights. He loosened his tie as he got into his car, exhausted but eager to get home. The weight of the day sat heavy on his shoulders. He turned onto a quieter road, avoiding the rush-hour traffic. The city's glass buildings faded into tree-lined streets and gated communities. It was a shortcut, one he had taken before. He barely noticed when the patrol car appeared behind him. Not until the flashing lights came on. His pulse quickened. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't driving erratically. Still, he pulled over, the familiar knot forming in his stomach. The routine played out as it always did. The slow approach. The skeptical eyes scanning him, scanning his car, searching for a reason, any reason, to justify the stop. And even though he knew how to handle it, even though he had spent years fighting for justice, even though he could quote every law on racial profiling, it still hurt. Because no matter how successful he was, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he proved himself, they still saw him as a threat. And the worst part? He had known this would happen. Back to the present as he pulled into his driveway, he let out a slow breath. His home was quiet, a contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded.
He sat in his car for a long moment before finally stepping out, the cool night air pressing against his skin. He walked up the steps, unlocked the door, and let the warmth of his home wash over him. But even here, in his own space, he couldn't shake what had happened. His phone vibrated. A message from his assistant. Saw the news. Are you okay? He didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to answer. Instead, he sat down, staring at the badge he had pulled out just hours ago, the badge that should have protected him from moments like this. But it hadn't. And that was the problem. The patrol car sat in silence, the soft hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Officer Grady tightened his grip on the steering wheel, staring out at the dimly lit street. His partner, Officer Collins, sat beside him, drumming his fingers against his knee. You sure about this? Collins finally asked, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Grady didn't answer right away. He had been on the force for over a decade, and in that time, he had developed what he called a sixth sense for trouble. Something about the car ahead of them, sleek, dark, and unfamiliar, just didn't sit right with him. It was parked near an upscale neighborhood, and the driver didn't match the usual profile of the residents here. At least, that's what his instincts told him. "Something's off," Grady muttered. Collins frowned. "You mean besides the fact that he's driving the speed limit?" Grady shot him a look. "You saw the way he slowed down. Like he was trying too hard to follow the rules." Collins sighed. He had only been with the department for a couple of years, but he had seen enough to recognize moments like these, when an experienced officer made a call based on instinct, but that instinct often led them into murky territory. "You ever think maybe he's just heading home?" Collins asked. Grady ignored him and reached for the radio. "Dispatch, we've got a suspicious vehicle on Maplewood Drive. Black sedan. Going to make a stop, over." A static crackle, then a response. "Copy that, proceed with caution." With that, Grady flicked on the lights. Collins exhaled sharply. There was no turning back now. As they approached the car, Grady felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was the moment. The moment where instincts and training met real-world decisions. He didn't know who this man was, but he had already made up his mind that something wasn't right. He glanced at Collins. "Stay sharp." Collins nodded but felt an uneasy twist in his stomach. The driver's side window rolled down smoothly, and Collins took his first real look at the man inside. Dark skin. Well-dressed. Calm, composed. But there was something in his eyes, a knowing look, like he had been through this before. "License and registration," Grady ordered, keeping his voice firm. The man didn't argue. Didn't ask questions.
Just moved slowly, deliberately. Too deliberately. Grady felt his pulse tick up. This guy knows how to act around cops. That meant he had experience. Why? When the man handed over his license, Collins leaned in slightly, reading the name. It sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Grady frowned as he looked over the license. "This your car?" The man didn't flinch. "Yes." "Where do you live?" "Downtown." Collins shifted. This was where things always got tricky. He had been taught that questioning a driver's place of residence was a simple verification method. But deep down, he knew that when a black driver was pulled over in a predominantly white neighborhood, that question carried a different weight. Grady's fingers twitched near his holster. Something didn't sit right. "Long way from home, isn't it?" The man's face remained unreadable. "Is there a problem, officers?" Collins felt himself stiffen. He could see where this was heading. Grady didn't hesitate. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" The man exhaled slowly. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" Grady's jaw tightened. Why was he questioning them? "Standard procedure," Collins interjected quickly, though even he wasn't sure what standard meant in this situation. The man was quiet for a moment, then nodded, reaching for his seatbelt. Why was he so calm? Most people would be nervous, defensive, guilty. Collins felt his pulse pick up. Had they just messed up? The shift in power, the moment the man stepped out of the car, the tension thickened. The air itself felt charged, like an unspoken battle was being fought. "Turn around, hands on the car," Grady ordered. Collins hesitated. Was this necessary? The man didn't resist. He turned, placing his hands flat against the vehicle. Grady pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, we got a possible suspicious individual, requesting, that won't be necessary." The man's voice was sharp. Too sharp. Collins felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something was wrong. Grady narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Slowly, the man turned around. His eyes locked onto Grady's with a level of confidence that made his stomach twist. Then, with precise movements, he reached into his jacket pocket. Grady's hand flew to his holster. Collins tensed. "Sir, keep your hands where we can." The man pulled out a sleek black wallet. He flipped it open. Collins saw it first. Gold. Polished. Authority. Then he read the words. State Attorney General's Office. His heart stopped. He turned to Grady, who had gone pale.
The man let the moment stretch. Let the silence sink in. "You're..." Grady stammered. "The state's top prosecutor," the man finished for him. "And I'd love to hear your justification for this stop." Collins swallowed hard. His brain scrambled for a response, but none came. "We were just..." Grady started, but even he seemed unsure how to finish the sentence. "Just what?" The prosecutor's voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. "Just racially profiling me? Just assuming I didn't belong?" Collins glanced at Grady. This was bad. Really bad. The prosecutor stepped forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "Run my plates," he said. "Verify who I am. Then we'll talk." Grady moved stiffly back to the patrol car. Collins hesitated, then followed. His fingers trembled slightly as he punched the license plate number into the system. 30 seconds later, reality hit like a freight train. The man they had just stopped wasn't only one of the most powerful legal figures in the state, he was the very person fighting against the kind of profiling they had just done. Collins felt sick. They had stopped the wrong man. When they turned back around, the prosecutor was waiting. His arms crossed. His expression unreadable. Collins could feel the weight of his stare, pressing down on them like a judgment passed before a verdict was spoken. "So," the prosecutor said, voice smooth as steel, "what's the official reason for this stop again?" Neither officer spoke. Because in that moment, they both knew, there was no good answer. The world seemed to slow down. The cool night air felt suffocating. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the prosecutor's car, casting eerie shadows across his face. Officer Grady's mouth went dry. His pulse pounded in his ears. Just minutes ago, he had felt in control of the situation, another routine stop, another suspicious individual to question. But now, the power dynamic had flipped. Officer Collins glanced at Grady, searching for guidance, but there was none. They had both realized their mistake too late. The man they had profiled, the man they had treated like a potential suspect, was no ordinary driver. He was the state's top prosecutor. And worse? He knew exactly what they had done. The prosecutor stood still, arms crossed, waiting. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Grady cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "Sir, we didn't recognize you." The prosecutor let out a humorless chuckle. "Didn't recognize me?" He took a slow step forward, his presence suddenly feeling much larger than it had moments ago. "Tell me, officer, if you had, would this stop have gone any differently?" Collins' stomach tightened. There was no good answer to that question.
Grady straightened his shoulders, trying to regain some control. "Sir, we were just conducting a routine check. You were driving under the speed limit, which made me suspicious," the prosecutor cut in sharply. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. Grady faltered. It was just an observation." The prosecutor shook his head. "No. It was an assumption. A dangerous one." He held up his badge, letting the gold emblem catch the flashing lights. "Tell me, officers, what do you think would have happened if I weren't holding this?" Collins swallowed hard. He didn't have to answer. They all knew. The prosecutor's gaze flicked to him. "You, what's your name?" Collins straightened. Officer Collins, sir. You're new, aren't you? Collins hesitated, then nodded. 2 years on the force. The prosecutor studied him for a moment. And when your partner told me to step out of the vehicle, did you think that was necessary? Collins felt Grady's eyes on him, warning him to stay quiet. But something about the way the prosecutor spoke made him hesitate. No, sir, Collins admitted. Grady tensed. The prosecutor nodded slowly. And yet, you said nothing. Collins opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words. Let me tell you something, Officer Collins. The prosecutor's voice was quiet but firm. You had a choice back there. You could have spoken up. You could have asked why this stop was escalating without probable cause. But you didn't. And that's how these things keep happening. Not just because of officers like him, he nodded toward Grady, but because of officers like you, who stay silent. Collins felt like he had been punched in the gut. He had known this stop felt wrong. He had felt the unease, the hesitation. But he had followed Grady's lead anyway. And now, he was being forced to face the reality of that choice. The prosecutor turned back to Grady. And you, what exactly was your plan here? Let's be honest with each other for a moment. You saw a black man in an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood, and you assumed he didn't belong. Didn't you? Grady's jaw clenched. Sir, I was just doing my job. The prosecutor's eyes darkened. Your job? He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Your job is to uphold the law. Not to harass people who look like me just because your instincts tell you they must be up to something. Grady's hands curled into fists. With all due respect, sir, you don't know what it's like out here. We make split-second decisions every day. We don't have the luxury of hindsight. The prosecutor held his gaze. I don't need hindsight to know that what you did tonight was wrong. Silence stretched between them.
Finally, the prosecutor took a step back, inhaling deeply, as if trying to calm the fire inside him. Run my plates, he said, voice colder now. Verify who I am. Then we'll talk. Grady hesitated, then turned stiffly toward the patrol car. Collins followed, feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted in an irreversible way. Inside the car, Grady's fingers flew over the keyboard, entering the license plate into the system. The screen flickered, then loaded with the driver's information. Collins leaned over. And there it was. State Attorney General's Office. Chief Prosecutor. A sinking feeling washed over them. Collins turned back toward the man standing outside. He wasn't just another driver. He wasn't just another case of profiling gone wrong. He was the one person in the entire state who had the power to hold them accountable. Grady stepped out of the patrol car, but his demeanor had changed. The confidence, the authority, it was gone. Sir, he started, but the prosecutor raised a hand. I don't want excuses. His voice was like steel. I want names. Badge numbers. Collins immediately rattled off his information, his voice steady but his stomach twisting into knots. Grady hesitated, then muttered his details. The prosecutor nodded, pulling out his phone. The soft click of a camera shutter echoed in the quiet night as he snapped a picture of their patrol car's license plate. I'll be filing a complaint, he said evenly. And we will be having a conversation, soon. Neither officer spoke. The prosecutor didn't wait for a response. He turned, stepped into his car, and pulled away without another word. As the taillights disappeared into the distance, Collins finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Jesus, he muttered. Grady said nothing. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have an answer. Officer Collins sat rigid in the passenger seat of the patrol car, staring out the window, watching the empty street where the prosecutor's car had disappeared just moments before. His chest was tight. His hands were clammy. He had been on the force for 2 years, and in that short time, he had seen his fair share of questionable stops, minor injustices brushed under the rug, and officers justifying their actions with vague notions of instinct and procedure. But tonight had been different. Tonight, he had been part of a mistake that he couldn't ignore. A mistake with consequences. A mistake that had a name and a title: State Prosecutor. Beside him, Officer Grady was unnervingly quiet, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. He had been on the force for over a decade, a hardened officer who prided himself on knowing how things worked on the streets. But now, he just sat there, staring at nothing, his jaw clenched so tightly Collins thought he might crack a tooth. Finally, Collins cleared his throat. "Grady, we need to talk about what just happened."
Grady didn't move. Didn't even acknowledge him. Collins sighed. "Look, I don't know about you, but that wasn't just another traffic stop. Grady cut him off with a sharp glare. "We did our job." Collins shook his head. "No. We stopped a man for no reason other than the fact that he looked out of place. And that man happened to be one of the most powerful legal figures in the state." Grady scoffed. "So what? We were doing what we were trained to do." "Trained to do what?" Collins snapped. "Assume guilt before innocence? Stop people based on a feeling?" Grady's eyes darkened. "Watch yourself, rookie." Collins turned his body fully toward him now. "Or what? You'll file a complaint against me? You'll tell the guys at the station that I stepped out of line for questioning you?" Grady exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? You still think this job is black and white." He turned to look at Collins, his expression unreadable. "You think you know better after 2 years? You don't. You weren't around when things were really bad. When the streets were worse. You didn't see what I saw. You haven't had to make the kinds of decisions I've had to make." Collins held his gaze. "You mean decisions like this? Where we stop a guy based on where he is and not what he's doing?" Grady didn't respond. Collins swallowed hard. "Look, I get that you've been on the force longer than me. I get that you've seen things I haven't. But tonight, we crossed a line. And you know it." Grady's grip on the wheel tightened. Collins continued. "We didn't stop him because he was speeding. We didn't stop him because he was breaking the law. We stopped him because we assumed he didn't belong." Still, Grady said nothing. Collins let out a deep breath. "And now? Now he has our names, our badge numbers, and a picture of our patrol car. And tomorrow morning, there's going to be a very different conversation happening at headquarters." That finally got a reaction. Grady's face twitched slightly. Collins ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "You do realize he could have pushed this further, right? We could have been all over the news by now. We could have been fired tonight. But he didn't do that. He gave us a chance. A chance to own up to it." Grady let out a bitter chuckle. "And what do you suggest we do? March into the station and confess? Ruin our careers?" Collins shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe we start by admitting that we were wrong. Maybe we take accountability before someone else forces us to." Grady scoffed. "And then what? The department hangs us out to dry?" Collins leaned forward. "Maybe that's the problem, Grady. Maybe that's why things never change. Because officers like you think admitting a mistake is a weakness. Because people are too afraid to challenge the system from within." Grady finally turned to fully face him, his eyes cold. "You think you're some kind of hero?"
"Huh? You think speaking up is going to fix everything?" Collins stared at him. "No. But staying silent sure as hell won't." The silence between them was thick, filled with everything that wasn't being said. Finally, Grady started the engine. "Let's get back to the station." Collins exhaled slowly, sitting back in his seat. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if the prosecutor would file a complaint, if an investigation would start, or if this would just become another story officers whispered about in the locker rooms. But he knew one thing for certain. Tonight had changed him. And no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to be the same officer who had started that shift. The police station was eerily quiet when officers Grady and Collins walked in. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the occasional ring of a desk phone cut through the silence. Most of the night shift officers were already at their desks, filing reports or making coffee, gearing up for the long hours ahead. Collins could feel the tension between him and Grady like an electric charge. What now? Neither of them had spoken much on the drive back. Grady had kept his jaw locked tight, his grip on the steering wheel tense. Collins had been lost in thought, replaying the stop over and over again in his head. The prosecutor's words still echoed in his mind. You had a choice back there. And you stayed silent. Now, the weight of what they had done pressed on his chest. He knew the consequences could come crashing down at any moment. As they made their way toward their desks, a voice called out. Yo, Grady. You good? Officer Harris, one of the senior guys, leaned back in his chair, tossing a rubber stress ball in the air. He had been on the force even longer than Grady and carried himself with the same air of confidence, a man who knew he had the system on his side. Grady nodded stiffly. Yeah. Just another night. Harris smirked. Yeah. You look like you saw a ghost. Grady forced a chuckle. Something like that. Collins felt a pang of unease. Was Grady really going to pretend like nothing happened? Harris leaned forward, lowering his voice. Heard you had a little run-in with someone important. Collins' stomach twisted. News traveled fast. Grady's face darkened. Where'd you hear that? Harris shrugged. Dispatch caught the plate you ran. Didn't take long for someone to put two and two together. Collins shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just something they could bury. People were already talking. Harris studied them for a moment, then smirked. Guessing the guy wasn't too happy, huh? Collins felt his jaw tighten. You could say that. Harris chuckled. Well, hope you boys got your story straight. Wouldn't want internal affairs sniffing around. Collins stiffened. The casual way Harris said it, the implication that they could simply craft a version of the story
that would protect them, made his skin crawl. Grady didn't respond. He just gave a short nod and turned toward his desk. Collins hesitated before following. His mind was racing. Was this how it worked? Something bad happened, and instead of taking responsibility, you just figured out how to make it disappear? He sank into his chair, staring at his untouched paperwork. His hands felt shaky. Across the room, Grady leaned forward, rubbing his temples. For the first time since the stop, Collins saw something unfamiliar in his partner's face. Doubt. Grady wasn't as sure of himself as he pretended to be. Maybe, just maybe, some part of him knew they had crossed a line. Collins took a deep breath. Now was the moment. If he was going to say something, he had to do it now. Grady, he said quietly. His partner looked up. We need to report this. Grady's eyes narrowed. Are you out of your mind? Collins swallowed hard. No. But we messed up. And we need to own it. Grady let out a bitter laugh. You really think throwing ourselves under the bus is the right move? Collins didn't flinch. I think doing the right thing is the right move. Grady exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus, Collins. You're still playing Boy Scout, huh? Collins clenched his fists. This isn't about playing anything. This is about doing our jobs the right way. Grady's face twisted. You don't get it, do you? We report this, and you think the department's going to pat us on the back for being honest? No. They're going to bury us. IA will make an example out of us. And for what? Colin's jaw tightened. For justice. For the people we're supposed to be protecting. For all the people who get stopped like that and don't have a badge to protect them. Grady slammed his hand on the desk. Damn it, Collins. You think this is the first time something like this has happened? Collins stared at him. That's exactly the problem. They held each other's gaze. Finally, Grady looked away. He muttered something under his breath, rubbing his face. He was cracking. Collins leaned forward. Look. I get it. This system protects its own. It covers up mistakes. But if we keep letting that happen, then we're just as bad as the ones who abuse it. Grady exhaled through his nose. So what? You're going to file a report? You're going to tell IAU and I stopped the damn state prosecutor because of instinct? Collins nodded. Yeah. I am. Grady shook his head in disbelief. You're going to ruin your career. Collins looked at him, his chest tightening, his heart pounding. Then so be it. For a long time, Grady didn't say anything. He just stared at Collins, like he was seeing him for the first time. Then, finally, he sighed and leaned back. You're serious? Yeah, Collins said softly. I am. Another beat of silence then, to Collins' surprise, Grady let out a bitter chuckle. Damn rookie. He shook his head.
Running a hand through his hair. You really don't get how this world works, do you? Collins hesitated. Maybe I do. Maybe that's why I want to change it. Grady sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Then, after a long pause, he muttered, Fine. Do what you want. Collins' breath caught. You mean? Grady held up a hand. I'm not saying I'm putting my name on anything. But if you go through with this? If you report it? I won't stop you. Collins nodded slowly. That was all he needed. He turned toward his computer, his hands shaking slightly as he opened a new report. Official statement, officer initiated stop. His fingers hovered over the keys. For years, officers had chosen to look the other way. To protect their own. He wasn't going to be one of them. With a deep breath, he started typing. The following morning, the air inside the precinct was thick with tension. Officer Collins sat at his desk, his heart pounding as he reviewed his written report for the final time. The words on the screen felt heavier than anything he had ever written in his 2 years on the force. He was reporting the stop. He had laid it all out, how they had stopped a man without probable cause, how they had escalated a routine encounter into something it never should have been. How they had assumed guilt before innocence, simply because of where the driver was and what he looked like. And worst of all, they had done it to the one man in the state who couldn't be ignored. Collins inhaled deeply, then hit submit. There was no going back now. The investigation begins by midday. The whispers had turned into full-blown conversations. Officers leaned in over their desks, muttering to each other as higher-ups moved through the station with tight expressions. Collins saw the captain speaking with internal affairs, their gazes flicking toward him every so often. The weight in his chest grew heavier. Grady sat at his own desk, arms crossed, saying nothing. Collins hadn't expected his partner to back him up, but at least he hadn't stopped him. That was more than most would have done. Collins turned back to his computer, forcing himself to focus, when a voice called his name. Officer Collins. My office. Now. He looked up to see Captain Reeves standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. Collins swallowed hard and rose from his chair. He could feel the eyes of the entire department on him as he followed the captain into the office, the door clicking shut behind them. Reeves leaned against his desk, arms folded. Do you have any idea what you've started? Collins didn't flinch. Yes, sir. I do. Reeves studied him for a long moment. The prosecutor filed an official complaint this morning. Your report backs up his version of events. Collins nodded. Because it's the truth. Reeves exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. You understand the position this puts us in, right? We're not talking about some random civilian filing a complaint. We're talking about the top prosecutor in the state. He's already made it clear he expects action to be taken. Collins squared his shoulders. Then maybe it's time we actually take action. Reeves' eyes darkened. Watch your tone, officer. Collins forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to do what was right. The captain sighed, shaking his head. Grady's on suspension pending investigation. Internal Affairs is reviewing everything, and the department is already getting heat from the media. You realize this is going to make you a lot of enemies, right? Collins nodded. Maybe. But it's also going to make things right. Reeves studied him again, and for a split second, Collins thought he saw something in his expression, respect. You know, Reeves said finally, most officers wouldn't have done what you did. Collins met his gaze. That's the problem, sir. Reeves let out a slow breath. Then, to Collins' surprise, he nodded. Get back to work, officer. Collins turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, Reeves spoke again. And, Collins? He looked back. You did the right thing. The fallout by the end of the week, the entire department was under scrutiny. The prosecutor's story had gone public, and the media had latched onto it like wildfire. The debate over racial profiling and police accountability was now on every news channel. Grady had been called in for questioning by Internal Affairs. Collins had seen him leave the captain's office earlier that day, his face blank, his movements stiff. Later, as Collins was gathering his things for the night, he heard a familiar voice behind him. You really did it, huh? Collins turned. Grady stood there, arms crossed, looking exhausted. I had to, Collins said simply. Grady sighed. You know, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have even thought twice about what we did that night. Wouldn't have lost a wink of sleep over it. Collins didn't say anything, letting him speak. But after IA grilled me for 2 hours today? Grady shook his head. I started thinking. Really thinking. And you know what? You were right. We screwed up. Collins raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerously close to an apology. Grady chuckled dryly. Don't get used to it. They stood in silence for a moment before Grady let out a breath. I don't know if this department is ever going to change, Collins. But if it does, maybe it starts with people like you. Collins felt a lump rise in his throat. Maybe, he said softly. With that, Grady gave a short nod and walked away. Collins watched him go, then exhaled deeply. The bigger picture. A month later, the department implemented new de-escalation and bias training programs. Officers were being required to go through stricter oversight reviews, and changes were slowly, painfully slowly, being made. Grady resigned before the investigation could finish. Collins didn't know whether it was to